The Russian Christ. Every time a barefoot prophet claimed he was Jesus, explained among all the claims of Jesus' reincarnation throughout history, the case of Ilya Ivanov in Russia is perhaps the most absurd and genuinely disturbing. Ivanov, a man from Siberia, became widely known in the early 2000s for walking barefoot and at times in a state of complete undress through the city while prophesying and proclaiming himself to be the returned Jesus Christ. He called himself the Christ of Siberia and gained a small number of fanatical followers who believed the world was about to end and that Ivanov was a new embodiment of God, sent to earth to correct the errors of corrupt churches. He preached on the streets, entered schools and markets, called for national repentance, and sometimes claimed that Orthodox priests had betrayed the light of God. Strangely, some local residents actually began to believe him, even offering him food and shelter. Some recordings show Ivanov condemning Russia's official church and calling himself the only chosen one. However, following a series of reports of public disturbances and concerns for his own mental and physical safety, as well as that of others, Russian authorities detained him and committed him to a psychiatric hospital. He has since disappeared from public view. The story of Ilya Ivanov is not just bizarre, it reflects a real phenomenon where social trauma, spiritual emptiness, and a wild charisma can create a literal street messiah, even in the modern era of cameras and the internet. The John Frum movement. The John Frum movement is one of the most bewildering phenomena in global spiritual history, a cargo sect on the island of Tanna, Vanuatu, that blends Christianity, local mythology, and American militarism in a truly absurd form. The movement began around the 1930s when local islanders claimed to have received visits or revelations from a mysterious figure named John Frum. He was described as a black man in an American military uniform who promised freedom, prosperity, and the return of their ancestral spirits. The name John Frum likely originated from the phrase John from America, a linguistic distortion that evolved into a messianic figure. When World War II broke out and thousands of U.S. soldiers arrived with ships, planes, and lavish supplies, the belief exploded. The people of Tanna saw the American soldiers as heavenly messengers and believed John Frum would return, bringing ships full of Coca-Cola, tents, trucks, weapons, and other celestial riches. After the war ended and the U.S. military departed, they began to imitate military rituals, building airstrips out of wood, wearing homemade uniforms, and holding an annual John Frum Day where they would carry American flags and sing church hymns to local rhythms. To them, John Frum was not merely a messenger of Jesus, but Jesus himself, in a modern militaristic form full of material blessings. To this day, hundreds of people still adhere to this belief, proving that religion can be born from a collision of cultures and the hope for a better world, even when it is wrapped in a remarkably surreal form. The Burning Bush Christian Church. The Burning Bush Christian Church represents one of the most absurd and literal prophetic claims in modern spiritual history. Founded by an eccentric man from Texas in the early 1990s, his full name is rarely published as many internal records are private. He claimed that he was not merely a pastor or a prophet, but the direct reincarnation of the burning bush that spoke to Moses on Mount Horeb, as described in Exodus chapter 3, verse 2. Yes, not Moses, not God, the bush. According to his teachings, the bush was its own sacred entity, a vessel for the Spirit of God that had now reincarnated as a human, namely him. He established a small church in a suburban area and began teaching that all plants, especially wild shrubs and desert flora, were organs of God's body that could speak if one listened in the Spirit. His followers, though few in number, believed that by praying while planting or watering vegetation, they could receive personal revelations. The church developed a liturgy that involved burning aromatic woods while rhythmically reading Exodus chapter 3 and petitioning the holy plant to guide their lives. Furthermore, the congregation was encouraged not to cut down trees, to abstain from eating certain vegetables, and even to hold a Holy Communion with an herbal drink made from fermented bush leaves. The church eventually disbanded after its founder claimed he would ascend to heaven by way of a banyan tree growing in his backyard, only to be found stuck in its branches for 2 full days. This story serves as an extreme example of how biblical symbols can be interpreted so literally as to reach a point of unreason, creating a theology better suited for a surrealist novel than for religious life. The body. The Body was a small apocalyptic community that became one of the most unsettling religious movements in modern America. Its leader, Wayne Bent, later known as Michael Trevesser, claimed that the Spirit of God had fully manifested within him, making him a divine representative on earth. The movement began as a small group of former Seventh-day Adventists seeking spiritual renewal, but soon evolved into an isolated community at a remote compound called Strong City, New Mexico. Trevesser predicted that the end of the world would occur on October 31st, 2007, and that only his followers would be spared. He urged members to cut off ties with the outside world and dedicate all their belongings to the group. Controversy erupted when he announced that he had been instructed to perform a purification ceremony with underage participants, something he described as a symbolic act of spiritual testing. Though he maintained that nothing improper happened, the events were documented and later presented in court. In 2008, Trevesser received a lengthy prison sentence related to misconduct involving minors. Even after his conviction, several followers continued to regard him as a divinely chosen figure, viewing the case as worldly persecution. The story of the Body illustrates how intense belief, isolation, and absolute authority can transform a faith movement into a closed world of obedience and control. The Concerned Christians. The Concerned Christians were one of the most mysterious and most thoroughly vanished apocalyptic Christian sects ever recorded. Based in Denver, Colorado, the group was led by Monty Kim Miller, a former insurance agent who claimed to be the final prophet, the Elijah of the end times. He proclaimed that God had told him Armageddon would only occur if the chosen people gathered in Jerusalem to witness the world's destruction from there. In the late 1990s, Miller and his followers, around 60 adults and children, suddenly vanished from their lives, selling their homes, quitting their jobs, and secretly moving to Israel. They were convinced that the year 2000 was the year of judgment and that they would witness the physical return of Jesus on the Mount of Olives, the site mentioned in Zechariah chapter 14 as the location of the Lord's arrival. Their presence was only detected by Israeli intelligence in late 1998, when authorities suspected the group might attempt to trigger a conflict in Jerusalem to fulfill the prophecy of Armageddon. Israel promptly arrested and deported dozens of the sect's members, including children. Monty Kim Miller himself was never seen in public again after the event, vanishing just like his own unfulfilled prophecy. To this day, the whereabouts and fate of the remaining followers are unknown. The Concerned Christians serve as a stark example of how an obsession with end-times prophecy can drive people to abandon everything, family, country, and even reason, to welcome an apocalypse that never arrives. The Freedomites. The Freedomites, or Sons of Freedom, were one of the most unusual, obstinate, and eccentric Christian sects in Canadian history, known for their extreme forms of protest, mass demonstrations without clothing while burning down their own homes and schools. The movement began in the early 20th century as a radical splinter group of Russian immigrants known as the Dukhobors, who were seeking a place to live peacefully according to the teachings of Jesus. However, the Sons of Freedom rejected not only violence and militarism, like their parent group, but also all forms of state authority, private property, formal education, and even modern technology. They believed the only path to salvation was to live in total freedom from the systems of the world, including government, law, and social institutions. In an effort to resist Canadian government mandates, particularly compulsory schooling for their children, the Freedomites staged extreme protests, gathering in large groups completely unclothed and singing hymns while setting fire to their own homes, schools, and public facilities. Some even bombed railway lines as a form of protest against industrialization. The Canadian government responded harshly, at one point separating more than 100 Freedomite children from their families and placing them in institutions for years, which caused long-lasting trauma and resentment. Although their influence has waned since the 1980s, a few small communities have persisted, maintaining a highly isolated and anarchistic lifestyle. The Freedomites are an extreme example of what happens when the teachings of Jesus on spiritual freedom are taken to a literal and political extreme, resulting in an unclothed Christian movement that burned everything in the name of God. The Church of Wells. The Church of Wells is an ultra-fundamentalist evangelical sect that emerged in the early 2010s in the small town of Wells, Texas. Led by three young preachers, Sean Morris, Jacob Gardner, and Ryan Ringnauld, the church quickly became known for its thunderous, judgmental, and apocalypse-obsessed preaching style, as well as for its extreme practices of social isolation, which resemble those of a classic sect. They claim that their group alone fully understands biblical truth and that the outside world, including all other churches, is completely apostate and destined for destruction. One of their central teachings is that the return of Jesus is imminent, and only those who repent according to their extreme standards will be saved. They accuse nearly all other Christians of being deceived by a false gospel. Members are forbidden from using social media, contacting family, or even seeking medical treatment as they believe God alone is the healer. The sect gained national attention when the family of a young woman, Catherine Grove, who had disappeared into the group, attempted to free her. She refused to leave, claiming she'd been truly born again by the church. Numerous reports have cited psychological control, emotional manipulation, and forced separation from the outside world. Though still active and continuing to preach on the streets of Texas, many observers have described them as a new Westboro with a sectarian style, less politically abrasive but more frightening in their spiritual fanaticism. The Church of Wales shows that even in the modern era, a small group can claim a monopoly on Jesus and sever people from the real world for the sake of an end that has not yet arrived. The Jesus Christians. The Jesus Christians are one of the most peculiar Christian groups to emerge from Australia, founded by David McKay in the early 1980s. At first glance, they appeared to be a radical community that emulated the life of Jesus literally, possessing no property, living nomadically, and preaching the gospel on the streets. But what truly placed them in the category of a highly unusual sect is their teaching that donating bodily organs, especially a kidney, is the highest expression of Christian love. Yes, they taught that greater love hath no man than one who would give up a kidney for another, quoting John chapter 15, verse 13, with extreme literalness. Over 30 members are known to have donated a kidney to a complete stranger, not in response to an ordinary donor request, but as a spiritual act and a personal ticket to salvation. The group was highly insular, cutting many members off from their families on the pretext that they were being called out of Babylon. McKay also controlled members' communications, published open letters to the families of those who betrayed the cross, and was known for his confrontational media appearances. They operated for a time in the United Kingdom, the U.S., Kenya, and India before beginning to crumble under public pressure and accusations of psychological control. McKay later founded a YouTube channel and a splinter organization called End Time Survivors. The Jesus Christians are a stark demonstration of how the teachings of Jesus can be twisted into a form of medical extremism, and how even an act as benevolent as organ donation can become a test of faith within a world of tightly controlled belief. The Church of Bible Understanding. The Church of Bible Understanding, COBU, formerly known as the Forever Family, is a prime example of how a small Christian group can transform into an exploitative business network under the guise of religion. Founded by Stuart Trail in 1971 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, COBU began as a Bible study group that attracted young hippies but evolved into an authoritarian sect with a structure of total control. Trail claimed to be the only person who truly understood the Bible and demanded absolute loyalty from his followers. They were required to surrender all their money, possessions, and time to the work of the church, which in practice meant working for COBU's carpet cleaning and other commercial service businesses. The group operated a successful network of companies, most notably Christian Brothers Carpet Cleaning, but paid its members extremely low wages. Most disturbingly, the group operated orphanages in Haiti, which became the focus of fundraising campaigns in the United States. Despite claims of helping orphans, investigative reports in 2018 uncovered deplorable, unhygienic, and uninhabitable conditions. A stark contrast to the millions of dollars in donations they had collected. Following Trail's death in 2018, many members finally left. Though COBU continues to exist in some form, the group serves as a dark example of exploitative faith-based capitalism, selling faith for profit with a leader who acts as prophet, CEO, and spiritual controller all at once. The Strong City Community, or Lord Our Righteousness Church. If a single group could encapsulate all the elements of religious fervor, messianic claims, doomsday prophecies, isolation, controversial moral practices, and absurd self-documentation, then Strong City would be a prime candidate. Led by Wayne Bent, also known as Michael Trevesser, this was a later phase of the Body sect, which you have read about previously. After proclaiming himself to be God the Father, Trevesser established a closed community in northern New Mexico called Strong City, complete with log cabins and special dwellings for the holy virgins. The centerpiece of his teaching was that the apocalypse would occur on a specific date, October 31st, 2007, and that he, as God himself, would spiritually rescue his faithful followers from a world about to be consumed by wrath. What makes this story so unusual is that Trevesser and his followers actually recorded everything. In a British Channel 4 documentary titled The End of the World Cult, Trevesser is shown partially unclothed performing rituals of spiritual intimacy with teenage girls, all while preaching in manipulative, apocalyptic language. When the doomsday date passed and nothing happened, his community began to collapse. In 2008, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison for misconduct involving a minor. Yet some followers still believe that the apocalypse did occur spiritually and that Trevesser is a god who was sacrificed by an unbelieving world. Strong City was not just a sect, it was a delusional religious theater, captured on camera and seasoned with controversy, apocalypse, and a dark charisma. It stands as a stark warning that false prophecies can be more than just lies, they can be filmed and sold as truth.